HighBridge, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Metaphysical Club, A Story of Ideas in America, by Louis Menand, read by Paul Heitsch. Preface. It is a remarkable fact about the United States that it fought a civil war without undergoing a change in its form of government. The Constitution was not abandoned during the American Civil War. Elections were not suspended. There was no coup d'etat. The war was fought to preserve the system of government that had been established at the nation's founding, to prove, in fact, that the system was worth preserving, that the idea of democracy had not failed. This is the meaning of the Gettysburg Address and of the great fighting cry of the North, Union. And the system was preserved. The Union did survive. But in almost every other respect, the United States became a different country. The war alone did not make America modern, but the war marks the birth of modern America. As a political and economic event, the transformation is not hard to see or difficult to explain. Secession allowed the North, for 4 years, to set the terms for national expansion without interference from the South, and the wartime Congress did not let the opportunity slip. That Congress was one of the most active in American history. It supported scientific training and research. It established the first system of national taxation and created the first significant national currency. It made possible the construction of public universities and the completion of the Transcontinental Railway. It turned the federal government into the legislative engine of social and economic progress. And it helped to win a war. The military defeat of the Confederacy made the Republican Party the dominant force in national politics after 1865, and the Republican Party was the champion of business. For more than 30 years, a strong central government protected and promoted the ascendance of industrial capitalism and the way of life associated with it, the way of life we call modern. To this extent, the outcome of the Civil War was a validation, as Lincoln had hoped it would be, of the American experiment, except for one thing, which is that people who live in democratic societies are not supposed to settle their disagreements by killing one another. For the generation that lived through it, the Civil War was a terrible and traumatic experience. It tore a hole in their lives. To some of them, the war seemed not just a failure of democracy, but a failure of culture, a failure of ideas. As traumatic wars do, as the First World War would do for many Europeans 60 years later, and as the Vietnam War would do for many Americans 100 years later, the Civil War discredited the beliefs and assumptions of the era that preceded it. Those beliefs had not prevented the country from going to war. They had not prepared it for the astonishing violence the war unleashed. They seemed absurdly obsolete in the new post-war world. The Civil War swept away the slave civilization of the South, but it swept away almost the whole intellectual culture of the North along with it. It took nearly half a century for the United States to develop a culture to replace it, to find a set of ideas and a way of thinking that would help people cope with the conditions of modern life. That struggle is the subject of this book. There are many paths through this story. The one that is followed here runs through the lives of 4 people: Oliver Wendell Holmes, William James, Charles S. Peirce, and John Dewey. These people had highly distinctive personalities, and they did not always agree with one another, but their careers intersected at many points, and together they were more responsible than any other group for moving American thought into the modern world. They not only had an unparalleled influence on other writers and thinkers, they had an enormous influence on American life. Their ideas changed the way Americans thought, and continue to think, about education, democracy, liberty, justice, and tolerance. And as a consequence, they changed the way Americans live, the way they learn, the way they express their views, the way they understand themselves, and the way they treat people who are different from themselves. We are still living, to a great extent, in a country these thinkers helped to make. Within this claim for the importance of Holmes, James, Peirce, and Dewey and the work they did, there is a point about the nature of intellectual culture. It is a point, in fact, which is very much a part of their legacy. There is a difference between an idea and an ideology. The suggestion that Holmes, James, Peirce, and Dewey were the first modern thinkers in the United States, that they helped put Americans into a better relation with the conditions of modern life, does not mean that their thought constituted a justification of those conditions. It did not. But it cannot be said that their thought stands in radical opposition to those conditions either. If we are looking for alternative visions of American life in the decades following the Civil War, Holmes, James, Peirce, and Dewey are not the figures we would turn to. This has something to do, no doubt, with their temperaments and their politics, but it is also a consequence of their attitude towards ideas. What was that attitude? If we strain out the differences, personal and philosophical, they had with one another, we can say that what these four thinkers had in common was not a group of ideas, but a single idea, an idea about ideas. They all believed that ideas are not out there waiting to be discovered, but are tools, like forks and knives and microchips, that people devise to cope with the world in which they find themselves. They believed that ideas are produced not by individuals, but by groups of individuals, that ideas are social. They believed that ideas do not develop according to some inner logic of their own, but are entirely dependent, like germs, on their human carriers and the environment. And they believed that since ideas are provisional responses to particular and unreproducible circumstances, their survival depends not on their immutability, but on their adaptability. The belief that ideas should never become ideologies, either justifying the status quo or dictating some transcendent imperative for renouncing it, was the essence of what they taught. In many ways, this was a liberating attitude, and it accounts for the popularity Holmes, James, and Dewey, Peirce is a special case, enjoyed in their lifetimes, and for the effect they had on a whole generation of judges, teachers, journalists, philosophers, psychologists, social scientists, law professors, and even poets. They taught a kind of skepticism that helped people cope with life in a heterogeneous, industrialized, mass-market society, a society in which older human bonds of custom and community seemed to have become attenuated and to have been replaced by more impersonal networks of obligation and authority. But skepticism is also one of the qualities that make societies like that work. It is what permits the continual state of upheaval that capitalism thrives on. Holmes, James, Peirce, and Dewey helped to free thought from thraldom to official ideologies of the church or the state or even the academy. There is also, though implicit in what they wrote, a recognition of the limits of what thought can do in the struggle to increase human happiness. This book is an effort to write about these ideas in their own spirit, that is, to try to see ideas as always soaked through by the personal and social situations in which we find them. Holmes, James, Peirce, and Dewey were philosophers, and their work is part of the history of abstract thought. Its philosophical merits were contested in its own time, and they are contested today. This book is not a work of philosophical argument, though. It is a work of historical interpretation. It describes a change in American life by looking at a change in its intellectual assumptions. Those assumptions changed because the country became a different place. As with every change, there was gain and there was loss. This story, if it has been told in the right way, should help make possible a better measure of both. Part 1. 1. The Politics of Slavery. 1. Oliver Wendell Holmes, Jr. was an officer in the Union Army. He stood 6 feet 3 inches tall and had a soldierly bearing. In later life, he loved to use military metaphors in his speeches and his conversation. He didn't mind being referred to good-naturedly as Captain Holmes, and he wore his enormous military mustaches until his death in 1935 at the age of 93. The war was the central experience of his life, and he kept its memory alive. Every year he drank a glass of wine in observance of the anniversary of the Battle of Antietam, where he had been shot in the neck and left briefly behind enemy lines for dead. But Holmes hated the war. He was 20 years old and weighed just 136 pounds at the time of his first battle at Ball's Bluff, where he was shot through the chest. He fought bravely and he was resilient, but he was not strong in a brute sense, and as the war went on, the physical ordeal was punishing. He was wounded 3 times in all, the 3rd time in an engagement leading up to the Battle of Chancellorsville when he was shot in the foot. He hoped the foot would have to be amputated so he could be discharged, but it was spared, and he served out his commission. Many of his friends were killed in battle, some of them in front of his eyes. Those glasses of wine were toasts to pain. Holmes recovered from the wounds. The effects of the mental ordeal were permanent. He had gone off to fight because of his moral beliefs, which he held with singular fervor. The war did more than make him lose those beliefs. It made him lose his belief in beliefs. It impressed on his mind, in the most graphic and indelible way, a certain idea about the limits of ideas. This idea he stuck to, with a grimness and, at times, a cynicism that have occasionally repelled people who have studied his life and thought. But it is the idea that underlies many of the opinions he wrote, long after the war ended, as an Associate Justice of the United States Supreme Court. To understand the road Holmes had to travel in order to write those opinions, we have to go back to one of the worlds the Civil War made obsolete, the world of pre-war Boston. 2. We think of the Civil War as a way to save the Union and to abolish slavery, but before the fighting began, most people regarded these as incompatible ideals. Northerners who wanted to preserve the Union did not wish to see slavery extended into the territories. Some of them hoped it would wither away in the states where it persisted. But many Northern businessmen believed that losing the South would mean economic catastrophe, and many of their employees believed that freeing the slaves would mean lower wages. They feared secession far more than they disliked slavery, and they were unwilling to risk the former by trying to pressure the South into giving up the latter. The abolitionists were careless of the future of the nation. "If thy right hand offend thee, cut it off," was the text they preached. They despised the Unionists as people who put self-interest ahead of righteousness, and they considered any measure short of abolition or partition to be a bargain with evil. They baited the Unionists with charges of hypocrisy and greed. The Unionists responded by accusing the abolitionists of goading the South into secession and by trying to run them out of town and sometimes to kill them. Before there was a war against the South, there was a war within the North. Holmes' father, Dr. Oliver Wendell Holmes, Sr., was a Unionist. The Holmeses were related to families that had prospered in New England since the time of the Puritans: the Olivers, the Wendells, the Quinceys, the Bradstreets, the Cabots, the Jacksons, and the Lees, but they were not exceptionally wealthy. Dr. Holmes was a professor. His father, Abiel, had been a minister. He regarded himself as a New England Brahmin, a term he coined, by which he meant not merely a person of good family, but a scholar, or what we would call an intellectual. His own mind was a mixture of enlightenment and conformity. He combined largeness of intellect with narrowness of culture. Dr. Holmes had become famous in 1830, the year after he graduated from Harvard, when he wrote a popular poem protesting the breakup of the USS Constitution, Old Ironsides. After college, he tried the law, but quickly switched to medicine. He studied in Paris and in 1843, when he was 34, published a paper on the causes of puerperal or childbed fever that turned out to be a landmark work in the germ theory of disease. He showed that the disease was carried from childbirth to childbirth by the attending physician. It was a controversial paper among the medical establishment. He joined the faculty of the Harvard Medical School, where he eventually served as dean. But his celebrity came from his activities as a belletrist. He was one of the first members of the Saturday Club, a literary dining and conversation society whose participants included Emerson, Hawthorne, Longfellow, Richard Henry Dana Jr., James Russell Lowell, and Charles Eliot Norton. He was a founder of the Atlantic Monthly, whose name he invented, and in whose pages he published his popular column of aperçus, The Autocrat of the Breakfast Table, followed by The Professor at the Breakfast Table and The Poet at the Breakfast Table. He wrote hundreds of verses and 3 novels. Many people, and not only Bostonians, believed him to be the greatest talker they had ever heard. Yet he was unabashedly provincial. His chief ambition was to represent the Boston point of view in all things. He also suffered from asthma, which made travel uncomfortable. On the other hand, he regarded the Boston point of view as pretty much the only point of view worth representing. He considered Boston the thinking center of the continent and, therefore, of the planet. Or, as he also put it in a phrase that became the city's nickname for itself, Boston State House is the hub of the solar system. He was an enemy of Calvinism, which had been his father's religion, and a rationalist. But his faith in good breeding was nearly atavistic, and he saw no reason to challenge the premises of a social dispensation that had, over the course of 2 centuries, contrived to produce a man as genial and accomplished as himself. Dr. Holmes' views on political issues, therefore, tended to be reflexive. He took his cues from his own instincts and the prevailing tendencies, and where these conflicted, he went with the tendencies. In 1850, for example, while he was serving as dean of the medical school, he was approached by a black man named Martin Delany, who requested admission. Delany was an exceptional character. He had, with Frederick Douglass, helped to found the leading black newspaper in the United States, the North Star. He later wrote a novel in answer to Uncle Tom's Cabin, called Blake, or The Huts of America, and served as a major in the Union Army, the highest rank achieved by an African American during the Civil War. He was already 38 years old in 1850, and his credentials for admission to medical school were unimpeachable, although he had been turned down by 4 schools, including the University of Pennsylvania, before he tried Harvard. As it happened, 2 other black candidates, Daniel Lang, Jr. and Isaac H. Snowden, both from Massachusetts, had applied for admission in the same year. Lang and Snowden were sponsored by the American Colonization Society, a group that advocated resettling African Americans in Liberia as a solution to the problem of slavery. They promised to emigrate as soon as they received their degrees. Delany made it clear that he intended to practice in the United States. Holmes could see no reason not to admit all 3. He also arranged to admit, on the understanding that she would not sit in the regular anatomy class, the first woman to attend Harvard Medical School, Harriet Hunt, another Bostonian, though it was his view that for the most part the education of women was a wasteful practice. There were a few women who had the capacity to profit from education, he once conceded, Madame de Stael, for example, but a natural law is not disproved by a pickled monster. The medical students revolted. They notified the faculty of their objection to the presence of a woman at the lectures, and Delany, Lang, and Snowden were ostracized. In December, 60 students, a majority of the student body, met and approved a petition resolving that we cannot consent to be identified as fellow students with blacks, whose company we would not keep in the streets, and whose society as associates we would not tolerate in our houses, and that we feel our grievances to be but the beginning of an evil, which, if not checked, will increase, and that the number of respectable white students will, in future, be in an inverse ratio to that of blacks. A slightly smaller group, of 48 students, submitted a dissenting petition, noting that, as unpleasant as the situation was, they would feel it a far greater evil if, in the present state of public feeling, a medical college in Boston could refuse to this unfortunate class any privileges of education which it is in the power of the profession to bestow. The faculty met for 2 evenings at Holmes' house. At first it held firm, but after it received notice from some of the white students of their intention to transfer, it capitulated and directed Holmes to inform the American Colonization Society that the result of this experiment has satisfied the medical school faculty that the intermixing of races is distasteful to a large portion of the class and injurious to the interests of the school, and that no applications from black candidates would be accepted in the future. Delaney, Lang, and Snowden were not permitted to register for the following term. Harriet Hunt had already withdrawn her application on the advice of the faculty. Holmes had seen nothing wrong with admitting these new students, but when the consensus of his colleagues moved in the other direction, he seems to have seen nothing wrong with changing his course. Lang ended up at Dartmouth, where he received his degree. Snowden returned to study privately with a surgeon at Massachusetts General Hospital. In 1853 he reapplied to Harvard and was rejected. Delaney stuck around. He expected his cause to be taken up by the Boston abolitionists, who were then embattled in a series of highly publicized efforts on behalf of escaped slaves being hunted down under the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850. In October, a few weeks before Delaney arrived in Cambridge, a Boston Vigilance Committee, led by the minister Theodore Parker, had run out of town 2 agents who were trying to hunt down William and Ellen Craft, a black couple who had escaped from Georgia disguised as a white gentleman and his manservant. In February 1851, after a black waiter and former slave known as Shadrach was seized by slave catchers in a Boston coffeehouse, an anti-slavery posse stormed the federal courthouse where he was being held, overwhelmed the marshals, and got him safely onto the Underground Railroad to Canada, where he eventually opened his own restaurant. In April, 300 soldiers and armed deputies, marching in the dead of night, succeeded in escorting a third fugitive, 17-year-old Thomas Sims of Georgia, to the ship in Boston Harbor waiting to return him to slavery. But no abolitionist protested the expulsion of Lang, Snowden, and Delaney from the Harvard Medical School. No one seems to have complained about the fate of Harriet Hunt either. Harvard Medical School did not admit a woman until 1945. Part of the reason was that the abolitionists disapproved of the meliorist policies of the American Colonization Society and were not disposed to enter into a grievance on their behalf. But Delaney concluded that the anti-slavery activists were more offended by the notion of Southerners presuming to send their agents into northern cities to retrieve their property than they were by discrimination against any particular black man already in their midst. And he was not wrong, for the politics of slavery in antebellum Boston was a complicated business. 3. The mill towns that sprang up in the Merrimack Valley north of Boston around 1820, Haverhill, Lawrence, Lowell, were heavily dependent on Southern cotton, which they made into finished goods and then sold, along with footwear, machine parts, rubber goods, and other manufactured products, back to the South. The dependency ran in both directions, for the South had no real industrial base of its own. There were more cotton spindles in Lowell, Massachusetts in 1860 than in all 11 of the states that eventually made up the Confederacy combined. The city of Boston, by the middle of the 19th century, had become a financial service center with a large stake in this peculiar domestic economy. The state's business leaders and most of its political leaders had no interest in antagonizing the South, and for anti-slavery campaigners, State Street, which was the main address of the Boston banking industry, became a synonym for appeasement. The hero of State Street was Daniel Webster, whose 7th of March speech in the United States Senate, invoking the principle of union above section, had cleared the way for the Compromise of 1850. That act, really a series of acts, dealt with the status of slavery in the new territories and in California in a manner satisfactory to the South. It also responded to Southern demands for reinforcement of the fugitive slave laws. Laws affirming the property rights of slaveholders in former slaves who had escaped across state lines had been on the books since 1793. Under the terms of the Compromise, their enforcement became for the first time a federal responsibility, which meant that Southern slaveholders could enlist federal marshals and magistrates in their efforts to hunt down and retrieve refugees in the North, thereby trumping the authority of local officials and state liberty laws. The new fugitive slave law was the least debated item in the Compromise of 1850, but it radicalized the North. It pushed many previously passive Unionists into active animosity toward the South, not because they considered the law an encroachment on the liberties of black Americans, but because they considered it an encroachment on the liberties of Northern whites. It was a degradation which the North would not permit, wrote Ulysses S. Grant near the end of his life, and he regarded it as the prime instigator of the war. The great majority of the people of the North had no particular quarrel with slavery, so long as they were not forced to have it themselves. But they were not willing to play the role of police for the South in the protection of this particular institution. A Northerner might therefore resent and resist the mandates of the fugitive slave law without being an advocate of abolition. Richard Henry Dana, for example, considered himself a political conservative, but he risked his life representing fugitives and their protectors in federal court in Boston. He was not only attacked in the streets for his efforts, he was snubbed socially, as was his friend Charles Sumner, who had denounced the Compromise in a speech at Faneuil Hall as belonging to the immortal catalogue of national crimes dating back to ancient Rome. George Ticknor, the cynosure of Boston high society, sent Dana a note after he appeared as counsel in the Sims case, informing him that they would never meet again. The year before, he had rented Dana his summer home. Ticknor is a representative figure of the pre-war Boston establishment. He occupies the place where its business, legal, and academic interests intersected. He was the son of a fairly successful merchant. He married a daughter of Samuel Eliot, an extremely successful merchant. His mother's grandson by her first marriage was George Ticknor Curtis, a lawyer who became the United States Commissioner charged with overseeing the enforcement of the fugitive slave law. He facilitated the return to slavery of Thomas Sims. George Curtis's brother, Benjamin, was the judge at the trial at which the rescuers of Shadrach were convicted. He soon became, on Webster's recommendation, an Associate Justice of the United States Supreme Court. All three were close friends of Daniel Webster. But Ticknor was not a businessman or a lawyer himself. He was a former Harvard professor who had been educated at Dartmouth and then in Europe. He was an academic reformer, a scholar of Spanish literature, and a philanthropist, one of the founders of the Boston Public Library. His views on slavery were dictated in part by family connections and by the social circles in which he moved, but they were also the views of a Harvard Unitarian. Unitarianism, to which Harvard College essentially converted following the appointment of Henry Wayne as Hollis Professor of Divinity in 1805, was a creed founded on a belief in the innate moral goodness of the individual, in reaction to Calvinism, which was a creed founded on a belief in the innate moral depravity of the individual. It was, in many ways, a religion that led its followers naturally to oppose slavery. The leaders of the anti-slavery posses that stormed the federal courthouse to rescue captured fugitives, Theodore Parker and Thomas Wentworth Higginson, were graduates of the Unitarian Harvard Divinity School. But many Harvard professors were Unitarians of a different stripe. They were social conservatives. They believed in law and order and the sanctity of property. The ministerial spokesman for Boston Unitarianism, William Ellery Channing, was connected by birth and marriage to the New England mercantile elite. His parents had...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?